Hello, citizens. Let's talk about... Dad, what do you think we should talk about?
What do you want to talk about?
I don't know.
Dads. They've been around since the beginning. But what do we really know about them? It's time to start asking questions. I'm Chris Brunt. This is PODRE.
Oh, hi, I'm Julian. Remember Julian what? What is it? Julian, help me think. Oh, yeah, Julian Isaiah Brunt, and I call him Dad, but you can call him Chris Brunt.
Say my name.
Chris Brunt. But I am also a better singer.
Yeah, you are better. Here, come sit over here. There you go. Pull up a chair, man. Tell me about your brother. What's your brother like?
He is good, and he will come up soon.
Mm-hmm.
You are a very very, very fun people to listen to my podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Very fun.
We love our audience.
Yes, we love you.
We appreciate you.
We really appreciate you for watching this. We appreciate only you.
Only you.
Only
you.
We only...
Who are some of your favorite musicians, Julian? Who do you like? Whose music do you like?
The Beastie Boys and the Strokes.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody else? Tell me your favorite music.
Yeah. Tell us your favorite music.
So you can send any paper planes that you ever want to.
Yeah, we accept paper planes. Also Twitter.
We definitely accept Twitter. And we always will accept a letter.
Yeah.
Always. An email. Anything.
Maybe we should get like a P.O. box.
And we are going to
send money. My guest today is Daniel Magariel. Novelist, professor at Columbia University, husband, father, all-around mensch, and a good friend of mine. His first novel, One of the Boys, is a tour de force autobiographical tale of growing up in a dysfunctional family with a deeply problematic family member, in this case a brilliant but narcissistic, crack-addicted father who inflicts several different kinds of trauma on his children. Called Gripping and Heartfelt by the New York Times. It's thrilling and gorgeously written, and it's available now. His second novel, Walk the Darkness Down, will be out this summer from Bloombury. We're going to talk about both novels and the real-life model for that unforgettable father character, and a lot more in just a minute. But first, a little bit of the unauthorized autobiography of Chris Brunt. That's next. I grew up around some shit. Not as much as some people. Not as much as my guest today, Daniel Magariel. Maybe not even as much as you, whoever's listening. I'm not doing the suffering Olympics here, but I did grow up around some shit. There were people in my family who were violent, who were addicts. There were guns when there shouldn't have been guns. There were those red and blue lights out the window sometimes. Mostly there was a lot of noise. That's what I remember most. The noise and the fear. Growing up in that environment didn't turn me into a tough guy, unfortunately. What I did was I got mouthy. I got secretive. I learned how to deceive others and myself. I got really into art and culture and music and books and living in my head. A little later, I got really into drugs and alcohol too. Y'all know that story. But I never lost that panicky feeling, that, oh oh shit, this is getting very dangerous. People are about to get hurt. Someone should do something. Someone, not me. I'm really good at shit's going down. See ya. I fucking disappear. Hop in my car, drive away, re-enter my more carefully curated world. The worlds I've tried to build for myself elsewhere, far from home. There was one night when, growing up, when I couldn't do that. I'm going to tell this story, and the person I'm talking about probably has no memory of it because of the state they were in when it happened. But I've definitely never forgotten it. I'm telling the story now because I've always had the sense that there's something essential in it for me. Like it's a key that unlocks something about who I am that's vitally important. And if I tell the story right, if nothing is left in shadow, I'll finally hear it. And whatever that is, I need to hear it. Like I discussed with Keith Gesson, being a parent is in part a journey of self-discovery, of self-analysis. And leaving things in the shadows doesn't just affect me anymore. I have my own family now. And they need and deserve a version of me that isn't plagued by old nightmares. So here goes. It was one night I was a teenager, and I came home, parked my car out front, and walked up to the garage. We had one of those automatic garage doors where you punch in the code on the side, and the whole garage door opens really slowly, really loudly. And as the door opened, I saw that the lights were on in the garage, and I saw someone was inside. And it was a family member. And I looked down at his hand, and I saw that he was holding a gun. It was a big gun. It was a .45 handgun. And I could tell by the look on his face that he was in a very, very, very bad frame of mind. And I wanted to just kind of back up slowly, walk back down the driveway and get in my car and leave, but he reached back and slapped the button that closed the garage door, and it began to close behind me. And after all that noise, the garage door was closed, and it was silent, and it was just the two of us inside. I said, "What's going on?" He's kind of breathing funny, heaving with this sort of inner turmoil, and he was really fucking drunk. He said, "I'm gonna kill her." I said, "Who?" I was worried that whoever that who was lived at our house. But he said, he's gonna go kill a girlfriend. I said, "Oh, don't do that." "Why? What's going on?" And he proceeded to tell me why he was so angry. He basically felt like he was being harassed by this person, and he had no choice but to go murder her. And I'm panicking now, having that oh shit feeling, but I don't know if I'm afraid for that person, or for him, or for me. I think probably all of the above. I kind of felt like anything was possible that night. I said, "Let's talk about this." He got really close to me and sort of reiterated his plans. And now I'm just thinking, whoa, I just gotta slow him down. I just gotta keep him talking, and I gotta get out of this fucking garage. So I kind of, almost like we were dancing, I would take one small step so that I could turn my body and he would turn his body. And now finally we're facing in the opposite directions, and I can reach over to that same button that he pushed to close the door, and I can open it. And I said, look, we'd better smoke a few cigarettes before we make any big decisions. And he says, okay. So I hit the button and the door opens. And now at least we're outside again. At least we're not in that enclosed space together. But he's still holding the gun. He's still mad. We go out into the driveway and light up a couple smokes. And he's talking about how much he hates this person, about what they've done to him. And somewhere in there, the conversation shifts. Somewhere in there, he's not talking about her anymore. He's talking about other family members and what they've done to him and how he thinks they feel about him. And it's scary and it's brutal. And all the while, I'm still just trying to placate him. I'm just trying to say whatever I can think of to disarm. I'm saying, no, you got it all wrong. Everything's fine. Everything's going to be fine. But the conversation finally comes around to me and how he feels about me and how he thinks I feel about him. And at this point, he's gotten really close to me with his body, and I'm just watching that gun in his hand as he puts his arm around me and he pulls me in close. And I try to turn it into like I'm holding him up, I'm helping him keep his balance because he's so fucking drunk. But then he tightens his grip with his arm. He says to me, "You think you're better than me?" I said, no. And now he's turned the embrace into a headlock. And he's pulling me down. And I'm bending at the shoulders, looking at the gun. And he says, "They all think you're better than me. I'm a piece of shit. You think I'm a piece of shit." And I'm saying, no. As I feel the gun touch my head. And he's holding it there. And he holds it there for a while. And I don't know what is going to happen. I know that I shouldn't move, shouldn't struggle, and shouldn't speak. I just held my hands out, like I was trying to keep my balance. He pressed it. And then finally he let go. I backed away and just started talking. Just trying to get this over with. Trying to get him away from that gun. The madness of that moment finally broken. It's funny when I look back on it, I didn't say something like, "Hey, what the fuck?" But I think I was in just a state of pure concentration to survive this encounter. And what seemed right to me was to make him feel like he had other options than hurting anybody that night. So that's what I tried to do. I tried to convince him, persuade him that he had all of these great options in front of him that didn't involve any violence. I remember him getting one more cigarette and kind of holding on to it awkwardly, and it really lost his equilibrium by then. He wasn't standing up straight, kind of swaying. And I said, "Listen, why don't you let me hold on to that gun tonight, just for tonight?" Eventually, I got it from him. He kind of left it sitting out there for me to take in. And I assume just went in, collapsed, passed out. So I took the gun and I hid it. When morning came, I got the fuck out of there. We've never spoken about that night, me and this family member, ever. And years later, when I told my parents this story, they didn't believe me. I mean, they knew it was true. They had to know. Similar incidents had happened to them. Probably even worse shit with this exact same family member. So they knew it was true, but they couldn't bring themselves to admit to me that they knew the story was true. That didn't happen. You're exaggerating. Don't say that. This, by the way, is the actual definition of gaslighting. I tell you a story, you know that it's true, you know that I know that it's true, and yet you say right into my face that it's false. And the cost of admitting the story is true is too high. To admit that into our shared reality would be to admit its obvious consequential interpretation, which would be that a lot of shit has to change around here. We need to change dramatically. And that came with too high a cost. It's much easier to just go, nah, that didn't happen. You're exaggerating. Years go by and you think, am I exaggerating? People often talk about gaslighting like it's this malevolent tactic motivated purely by the desire to harm you, to make you feel crazy just for the hell of it. But in this case, and I think in many cases, it's a defensive tactic. It sure as hell can feel evil, can feel like malicious intent is behind it, but there's a desire underneath that to preserve and protect the self and the sense of reality that is under threat. I've talked to people who are victims of assault, especially sexual assault, and I think that that dynamic plays out in a lot of families or in workplaces. Don't come to me with the truth about this person. We can't proceed if you say that shit out loud. We take this on as the new true narrative. We're dead. It's the plot of every Greek tragedy. All of which are about family secrets, by the way. Things too terrible, too unspeakable to admit. And in the covering up, in the denial of them, in the gaslighting, the stage is set for even more nightmarish horrors to unfold. In every family that I've ever been close enough to have this level of inside knowledge, this dynamic has played out. It seems to be as common as families themselves. So how do I make sure this never happens in the family that I've started? How do I make sure that one day I'm not gaslighting my own kids? Because more than the events themselves, and I've only told you about one, there were many, but more than the events themselves, it was the gaslighting that really tore relationships apart in my family. It was the unwillingness to confront reality, the truth of what had happened, that fucking enraged me to the point of estrangement from some of these people. I can forgive a gun to my head quicker than I can forgive you telling me there was no gun to my head. And I came very close to not airing this episode for reasons that by now should be obvious. The last thing I want to do on this podcast is hurt anyone. But there is a kind of terrible inevitability to doing work like this. Autobiographical work. Suffice to say, the last thing you want is a writer in your family telling all your shit. So look, I want to say that my parents loved me deeply. Both of them did the very best they possibly could in some pretty wild situations. Faced down some impossible and harrowing choices. What's also true is that sometimes those choices left me vulnerable. Left all of us vulnerable. Unsafe. So if there is a key in the story for me, it's to be able to tell it without shame or bitterness. To arrive at a place where I don't hold these events or their aftermaths against anyone anymore. Not even against the person who nearly murdered me. Because I understand the pressure these people were under and that they were doing the best they could. But the second half of it is, I make damn sure that my home, the one I live in now, with my spouse and my 2 little boys, is a place where no one is afraid to tell the truth or hear the truth. Is a place where no one's safety is part of the bargain. Is a place where nobody ever feels as alone and afraid and out of options as we did that night.
I don't know.
Was I having a kid? I was probably having a kid. That's usually I've missed a lot of weddings because I keep having kids.
I was being a dad. Yeah, husband.
I've missed most of my best friends' weddings because my wife was in labor at the time.
Huh.
Which has only happened twice, but it's like that's for whatever reason. Everyone I know got married those 2 weekends. Yeah. Well, Danny, I've been spending a lot of time with you in the form of your debut novel, One of the Boys, over the last week. And I've already told you this. I've texted you what a marvelous fucking book it is, man. I remember reading it the first time and I read it straight through because I literally couldn't put it down. I read it all the way through. And this time I was kind of taking my time a bit more because I was thinking so much about the choices you made to write an autobiographical novel and sort of wondering what that may have meant for you at the time and what it means for you now. But also just kind of taking my time to look at the way you crafted this thing because it's so well crafted and it works so well to just kind of push the reader through on this kind of collision course with the character's destiny. And it's also there's so much raw feeling and there's so much vulnerability, especially in the narrator. And I admire it so much, man. I loved getting to read this book again. And I'm so excited for your next one.
Thanks, Chris. That's nice. Yeah, One of the Boys feels a bit like ancient history just because I've been, engrossed in the sophomore effort. But the second book's called Walk the Darkness Down.
Yeah.
It's comes out July of 2023, and it'll be at your local bookstores and online, etc.
We're going to talk first today about One of the Boys and its connection to your own life, your own family. One of the Boys published in what, Danny? 2017 by Scribner. It's every review of the book kind of begins with the father character, right? Like the unforgettable portrait. Here's the kind of chaotic energy at the heart of this novel. And you feel that in chapter 1, right? Like as soon as he steps on stage, you feel like the show is beginning. It made me think of an inside joke that you and I developed. Just the phrase, the eagle has landed. The eagle has landed.
Yeah.
Tell us what that meant and where it came from and why it's so darkly fucking funny.
My father always seemed to speak in like in like script form. He had just lines that just sort of like encompassed whatever it was he was trying. And most of them actually came from like, his influences, like films, right? And just like pulling
catchphrases.
Catchphrases from films. So the eagle has landed is always when something has been delivered. I have another. I hate to say I have other friends, Chris, but I have another friend who also has one just like that. I call them Halisms because my father's name is Hal. And it's you can use that. Yeah, he says
it's interesting. You don't name him in the novel.
I don't name any of the characters in the novel.
Anyone. This is a nameless novel.
Part of it is like when you're dealing with autobiographical material, and you're also trying to be a fiction writer. It's this balance of figuring out how to use this material from your own life, but also how to make it alive and fresh and just like something other than you and your own experiences. And so when I first started, in some ways I feel like I was very lucky to have had a fucked up childhood because I had the material from my first book. I knew what it was always going to be about. So I actually spent like 15 years learning to write with the same material over and over, just trying it in different voices, trying it in different point of views, trying it in different tenses, trying it with different pacing. And so,
but there was never any doubt that these were the stories, these are the characters, this is the world. This is where the writing begins.
This is where the writing begins, exactly. So I didn't know like how the sequence of the story was going to unfold necessarily.
I want to go back to the real life inspiration here, and the eagle has landed.
The eagle has landed. So he has other ones too, Chris. Like recently, he and I, we go through periods in which I sort of like welcome him back into my life, and then he does something like just horribly offensive, like I call my in-laws and ask for money. Like, it was like, or most recently, basically he's like, I'm moving to Cape May, New Jersey, and I'm like, no, you're not. Which is where I live now, right? And he's in Kansas City. He's like, well, I want to be close to my family. I'm like, well, Dad, we don't want to be close to you. And most because everything he touches can, he's my father. So obviously there's a strong affinity for him. There always will be. But part of loving someone is also knowing who they are and knowing that I don't necessarily want him to be super close to my family. So basically he reverts back with an email like, okay, I won't move close to you, but, please wire $25,000 to this account to seal the deal.
And he's dead serious. He's dead serious.
Oh, and I'm like,
he blackmails you over his own presence, right? Like, right. If you don't send me $25,000,
I'm showing up at your doorstep and I'm your problem.
I'm your problem.
So,
and that's a real threat, right?
It's a real threat, and he's always done this, specifically with me. And so I have an older brother and a younger sister, and part of the way he's always manipulated is he just has like radio silence for everyone else and just like locks it on one of us. And so what I did was I just democratized the whole thing. I like replied and added my brother and my sister and my wife and my brother-in-law and just, hey guys, I'm responding to my father here in this email telling him that I cannot be blackmailed. But
it's very lawyerly of you, right? Like bringing in witnesses, putting it all in writing. Here's what's happened, and here's what I'm going to do about it.
And he reverts back, which is this crazy email where he's just like, I can't believe you told everybody here. And he leans into my brother, who's done nothing, by the way. He's just like, why is he on here? He's still trying to figure out his latent homosexuality and his suicidal ideations, and I'm going to outlive him. And I'm just like, oh my God.
Wow.
Yeah. And then he comes at me and
hold on. I'm going to outlive him. He says this about his son.
His eldest. Yeah. It's like it's casual. And, if one of the boys, there's this obsession with the firstborn, and my father always had that. And so for him to dismiss his firstborn with a single line.
Is that sort of sentimental kind of like biblical notion that he's the patriarch?
The whole thing, right? Uh-huh. And he responds and he starts talking about my wife, and he's like, where do you come from? A putrid drop, where will you return? Worms and weeds. And then he's like, I will rise again, is what he basically said. And then he comes after me. So right, dismisses my brother with a single line. He like goes straight up like Old Testament, like, vengeful God.
Like the book of Job. Where did you come from? Like answering his own questions.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, a putrid drop. And then he comes after me, and it's like old Western, like masculine, like gunslinger mentality. And he's just like, so he goes, son, you're a liar, a cheat, and a horse thief. And I'm like, hold on. Did my dad just call me a horse thief?
And meant it? And meant it?
Yeah. He's like, and you spent 5 years writing a book that was 40 pages. And so my response back was just like, my book is way longer than 40 pages. And that was the whole response back.
Yeah, I mean, I'm holding it in my hands right now, and it's clearly well over 160 pages, Danny. So he's off by a factor of 4.
I mean, you should check out the big print version.
Is this not the big print version? I mean, it's but I mean, that insult, right? That little dig is a pretty fucking smart one on his part, right? I mean, to sort of take this incredible achievement of yours. Every person who wants to be a writer, there's nothing more precious than the idea of the debut. There's probably nothing that would be more vulnerable about. And of course, what your parents think of it, or how they feel about it, or how they feel about you as a writer. Like, I don't know anyone that writes that isn't in some way really vulnerable to that. And for him to zero in on that, I mean, to literally, quite in the most literal way possible, minimize the most important professional artistic achievement of your life is dastardly.
It is. But at the
it's
same
monstrous.
time, but I know the man so well, so that I can't be wounded by the precision of his arrows. And part of it is that some of the material that's explored in this book, some of the real stuff that actually happened, right? Like, he refuses, despite his sobriety now, he refuses to be honest about it. He has his own counter narrative where he is still the savior of the family, despite the fact that, like, he lost everything, due to a crack cocaine addiction, and became like horribly abusive and terribly manipulative. My brother hadn't spoken to him in 10 years.
Became or always was, right? I mean, it seems like that behavior certainly predated you guys and predated New Mexico.
It did. It certainly escalated. And you know how drugs can just make they can bring out the monster. One of the things what's strange about my father is that the further he got into drugs, the more he got into spirituality. So
I find this so fucking fascinating.
He would go on like days long binges, and they would be punctuated by us going to synagogue, and sitting there like on Yom Kippur and just like all day long. I mean, that hangover must have been nasty, but
was he hungover, or was he literally high on crack cocaine in synagogue?
No. He would not. Like, occasionally he would be high on crack cocaine, but usually those spheres were separate, Mm-hmm. And so when he would,
that sequence isn't that rare. Then that like you binge, and then as you are trying to get sober or clean up, you might go on a kind of spirituality jag. But it does seem it's different with him, right? How is it different?
Well, it was just they were happening in the same week every week.
This wasn't a long-term process. This was
2 days we don't see our father, and then the next day we're putting on tefillin at the synagogue in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And then we go back home, and we lose him for 2 more days.
It's part of that grandiosity of his that like he's going to speak to God one way or another, whether it's through a crack pipe or just sitting in synagogue and interpreting for the Lord.
That was a big part of it, without question. But I also think that there's a sensitivity to my father, and there was, I think, at core a desire to do right by his children, and this was a way that he could keep us in this place of worship, of care, of responsibility. Like, this is synagogue is a safe place, and this is what I'm doing for my children,
Well, the novel begins with him driving you guys from your mother's house in Kansas out to New Mexico to start a new life with him. And he's casting this as this great sort of masculine adventure. You're going out west. You're going to be these kind of cowboy figures, but it's also very spiritual in its sort of symbolism, right? He's chasing the great spirit. This is kind of like pseudo indigenous spirituality that he's kind of conjuring for you guys, and he's sort of presenting himself as the medium for that. So it does seem like he had some sense of himself as that kind of father who's going to sort of put you two in touch with the ultimate reality. I can see him dragging you to synagogue when he's still coming down.
Yeah.
And it all being of a piece for him.
And in order to do that, he had to vilify my mother, and to a degree that, and it's why the book's called One of the Boys. It's because there's this pact that he created. I mean, my sister is not included in the novel. I remember she read the book and she's like,
that was one of my questions.
Where am I?
What your siblings thought of it, but especially her, right? Because she's just sort of excised.
And this is one of the ways where, like, fiction is different from real life. Like, actually just putting all of sort of the feminine, maternal mystique into one figure, i.e. the mother.
Yeah. And all the misogyny directed towards
at a single place. It just became a cleaner and more powerful story in that way.
That's exactly it. Cleaner and more powerful. I mean, it just loads the whole fucking book with this charge and there's nothing to get in the way of it. There's no B plot. There's no, it's just all one direction, and it makes it like it's like opening up a fire hydrant, right? That kind of force. I will say, and I think this is probably the longest you and I have ever talked without talking about me at all, which is...
I'm trying to figure out why I'm enjoying this conversation.
It's weird, right? It's weird. It doesn't feel quite right. I've begun an autobiographical novel this summer, and I've actually given myself a sister in this book that I didn't have in real life. So in that way, once again, I'm sort of, through my own life and experiences, just trying to kind of correct your shortcomings and sins, frankly, as a man and as a person.
Natasha is a great name for that character, and she might look a lot like me minus the beard.
All right, so there's something else I want to get back to here, which is the idea of humor, because The Eagle Has Landed was a joke, and I've never met your father. I think for very good reason, right? Like, you never brought him around, we were never going to visit him or anything. Like, he's been a very literary character from my point of view for our entire, by now, very long and very wonderful friendship. And yet I've read this novel. I've talked to you, intimately at length about your childhood. And I mean, I have some sense of how difficult it was, how painful, how traumatic your life has been as a result of this man and the kind of father that he was and continues to be. And yet there's this like hilarious way that you talk about him, the way that you tell stories about him as a sort of comic figure. You said earlier that his arrows, no matter how precise, can't wound you anymore. And is humor a part of that? Is that a necessary part of that?
I don't think my father is very funny. Like,
really?
Like as a person, as a character, I feel like in some ways, but you actually have to take the step. Like, the way we talk about him is hilarious,
Yeah.
But the man himself is not very funny.
Is it because he's so fucking terrifying, or because he doesn't have a sense of humor, or?
I think he tries to have a sense of humor, but the jokes don't land. Which is hilarious, right? If you could just,
because the joke is on him, right?
The joke is on him, and that's like, you need that measure of distance. You have to understand that character and these scenarios, because in the book he's always sort of teetering on the edge of disaster in these different environments, and for the boys. And for me as well, right? Experiencing those things, it was always just horror, right? It's like, oh God, how bad can this get, right?
And he always ups the ante. There's always some kind of moment of chaotic genius where you think, well, this is bad, but holy shit, it's about to get a lot worse.
You need that measure of distance in order to appreciate just how hilarious that instinct is, because It's like the great comics always find a way to escalate in the most uncomfortable ways.
Yeah.
And so I think that the way that we recast him in our sort of and that I recast him, and it is just he's a character.
The preposterous, instinct for saying the most like ridiculous, grandiose thing in the moment that for him like evades. It's a little bit like the British Office character, the sort of his genius for evading responsibility and accountability in any moment, no matter how blatantly this shit is his fault. And you capture that in the novel, right? Like he creates these horrific scenarios where you and your brother, I say you, I mean the protagonist and his elder brother are in very serious danger, and we're readers watching two children, essentially, teenage boys, get put into these dangerous, abusive, scary situations, and we feel frightened for them. And then here's the father figure who will escalate the situation, he will turn the screw so that it's so much worse, while saying something that lets himself off the hook or pins it all on one of his two boys, or some outside figure who he wants to vilify, whether it's the mother or the basketball coach or the bartender. And it's that genius for always like, how did he do that? It's a kind of a magic trick of evading the most in your face responsibility that a person has, which is to care for their children and protect them. It's not as funny in the book as it is when you and I are fucking around, right? Like it's still darkly funny, right?
And just the extent to which this character is willing to delude himself. He believes these excuses. He believes them, Yeah. And so when my father looks at me and says, "You're a liar, a cheat, and a horse thief," like he's not making a joke. He doesn't see the humor in that. He's articulating something very specific in his mind, and it's catastrophic. When he's Moses with his staff picking apart my wife and his eldest son, he doesn't see the joke. He doesn't see he's actually channeling these models in his mind of like.
But Danny, that would break a lot of people. Like that would what you've been through with him, what your siblings have been through with him would destroy a lot of people. And you have evolved two very clear ways, very effective ways of not being broken by this. And one is like being able to laugh about him with your loved ones and sort of getting that comic distance, which is a way of sort of, I think, protecting yourself from its seriousness. But then at the same time, channeling this and converting this into art, which is totally earnest and dramatic and serious and heartfelt and vulnerable, and in a way that lets other people experience these emotions in a way that is powerful and valuable to them.
I think it took a long time for the humor to be there. And certainly it's a defense mechanism in lots of ways. Having to tell my father he couldn't move near us was really difficult. And I had to really think about that. I mean, I dismissed it casually in the opening of the conversation, but I mean, the reality is that he's still my father, and I know he's probably going through a hard time, and I'm sort of the last. He's always says this to me. He's like, "You're the only one I love," and it's just like, which is insane, but like I feel that because what he does is he makes me into like the last string, right? And like before the whole freaking thing breaks.
Well, it's so fucking manipulative. And again, it's that grandiosity. It's like he loves those huge absolute pronouncements, right? Yeah. And they're very seductive. I mean, when he says, and I do realize that we've completely conflated your real life father, the human being, with the character in this novel, but I think we can't help but do that, right, to some extent.
I mean, especially in the first, I'd say, half of the book, that he's basically that man. My father never got as bad. He got sober pretty quickly when bad things happened. When the cops showed up at his door, he got sober. I'd long moved out of the house at that point. We were back from New Mexico, but...
Well, I want to get back to that because it really gets into something complicated about the autobiographical novel and what fiction can do with one's real life story. But this notion that like the seductiveness of the way that he puts these sort of toxic expectations on people. There's a moment where he says to the brothers, he says, "Look at your brother," and you look at your brother. and he says, "You're his brother for life. You're his last
line of defense.
You're his last line of defense." And I fucking love that. I mean, I've said something very similar to that to my oldest about his brother, except I didn't say it as well. And when I read that line, I thought, I mean, there's a part of me that sort of had my guard down, and I thought, okay, that's the way to say that. You know what I mean? Like, that's
you should model your parenting after the
father. That kind of was in that moment. I was like, there we go. That's who we're emulating.
That's one of those moments in the book where I think the facade falls away, and I think the father has a moment of clarity where he sees his boys going after each other, and the bond of the boys is breaking. And part of him, I think, recognizes that maybe he had something to do with that. And part maybe he doesn't, but he sees the union of the boys falling apart, and he sits them down and he tells them to protect each other. But what's amazing to me about when that line came out, because you don't necessarily understand how lines operate throughout an entire book, especially when you're halfway through. And so, but that became like a prescription for the boys to save each other from the man who uttered those lines.
Yeah, no, it's dramatic irony, right? That he doesn't know as he's saying that they're each other's last line of defense for sure, but not against the outside world, against him. Yeah, against him. And he's totally oblivious to the resonance of that, which is what makes it like one of the most killer lines of the book. How did he get this way, man? Like, let's back up a little bit. What happened to this guy, man? Like, where did he come from, and how does he turn into this figure, this larger than life, terrifying biblical maniac who's also capable of these outpourings of love? And
it's a great question. I mean, the earliest stories I know of my father are ones where he just like he sounds like a spoiled brat. Like, I hate to say it, but it's like his dad was a butcher, his mother stayed at home. I think his
Kansas City. Is he from
Kansas City? I think his father ruled the house with an iron fist. I think he'd go after his wife as well. My dad moved to Arizona when he was younger, and he's just like, I'm going to live out here. And then his mom missed him so much that when his dad said, I would like you to move back to Kansas City, he's like, okay, buy me a convertible. It's just like, this man was a butcher, you know?
Bribe me back into the family.
Bribe me back. So then my dad,
that transactional way of being in a family, of like, what's in it for me, and you have to kind of buy my loyalty out of this. That's familiar.
And it's exactly. And the other story I've heard my whole life, and this is something that it's almost like a point of pride. He got super drunk one night, came back to his house in Westport, Kansas City, and apparently he claims that neo-Nazis had moved next door, and they knew that he was Jewish, and they'd broken his air conditioner. So my father goes upstairs, and he grabs his old Air Force rifle because he was actually kicked out of the Air Force. And I don't know the origin of that. I don't know how he got kicked out, but
probably drinking may have been involved there. Maybe,
probably. And he shoots like 6 live rounds into his neighbor's house, and then he passes out, and he wakes up with just like a whole like SWAT team like around his house, and the cover of the Kansas City Star the next day. And I found the article when I did some digging, Main Street Sniper, and just my father, like, and a beer that looks like mine, just being like escorted out of his house.
Wow.
Yeah.
First of all, was anybody hurt or wounded?
No one was hurt. I guess a piece of wood splintered and hit somebody.
And was there any indication that they were actually neo-Nazis? Or was this just like a family of 6, like, with like blonde hair?
There's nothing to indicate that they were anti-Semites.
All the seeds are there. I mean, the kind of likely, either alcohol or maybe, I don't know, at that point, drug-induced psychosis to decide, the kind of mania to decide that you're under siege by neo-Nazis and the only thing left to do is to open fire. The audacity of telling that story, your version of it, even when there's like the fucking Kansas City Star is telling you that like these were not neo-Nazis, these were just your neighbors. And to continue to be sort of to trumpet that and be proud of it and make it part of your personal legend. I mean, it was all right there. It was a young man. That's him.
Here's the wrinkle in the story. My mother, who's 13 years younger than my father, so he must have been 20, 8 at the time that happened. So she was 15. She was in high school living like 5 blocks away. And so she, as a high school kid, would walk by that house, be like, oh shit, that's that's where the main street. So when they first went on a date, he was still living in that house. And she walked in and she went on a date with the Main Street Sniper. She knew who it was. And something about it drew her. Like, I don't understand. I've asked her, like, did you ever bring this up to him? And she said, yes, on the first date. He brought it up to me. But in an apologetic way, not in like hey, you know, I fired 5 bullets into my neighbor's house, you know, 8 years ago.
You think that was maybe, yeah, like maybe kind of in a like, I'm really dark and sinister, and you seem to find that attractive.
But also, I'm not without remorse.
Yeah,
I can be sensitive.
I was going through a hard time.
I make mistakes. Love me. I'm vulnerable.
Are there changes over time? Is there a period where things are kind of okay, or where he's okay, or you guys are okay, and then things get bad? Or has it just been kind of one long, you know, sort of nightmarish block of this experience?
Listen, I think sobriety was a big thing for him.
And is that a clean break? Did he get clean and stayed clean?
You know, from my understanding, yes, but certainly like these delusions of grandeur are symptomatic of something. I do believe he's maintained his sobriety. But it hasn't changed sort of the character of the man. You know, I remember when I first moved to Syracuse, I had this little puppy, Otis, boxer puppy, Otis. And I just gotten him, and within days of moving there, my dad decided to come visit and check out Syracuse. It was the only time he went up there. And Otis got really sick. And I was broke. My stipend hadn't started. You know, I hadn't had a job for a month because I was relocating, and I needed like $600 for the urgent center. You know, and my dad was just like, "Yeah, I'll do it, but you know, it's going to be like 5% big." And I'm just like, "My dog is dying.
5 points a week.
You're going to charge me interest on a $500 loan to save the dog?" And it's just like, yeah, So it's shit like that. Like how do you make sense?
I mean, at least he didn't try to operate on the dog, which I feel like was probably like his plan B, right? Like, I'll take care of this, son. You go out for the day.
It's that kind of thing. But you know, there are also times where I'll have a conversation with him, and he'll start talking about my brother or something, and you just hear like you hear the sadness come into his voice, you know, and he's wondering whether his son still loves him. And you can feel it. And some of that's probably manipulation, but I think that he's always been so uncomfortable with vulnerability that he uses his own even to like manipulate himself in ways, you know, like to paint a portrait of himself, you know, as self as a victim.
Mary, you know, I talked to Mary Carr about writing The Liars Club. That she wasn't able to really write about anybody that she didn't, at the bottom of her heart, love.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was an interesting, I'd never heard anyone quite say it that way about writing, you know, autobiographically or writing memoir, that there is a kind of baseline or a sort of prerequisite. Otherwise, you're writing a kind of caricature, or you're writing out of a sense of, you know, resentment that it's going to come through somehow, and the character's going to, you know, it's going to fall flat. So, I mean, I guess that's my question to you. Do you agree with that notion? And
I think it's absolutely the case. I think you have to love pretty much every character you write, and in some ways you have to like them too.
Can you love if it's based on a real person? Can you love the character you create, but not the person it's based on?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. I do think that there's a dissociation that happens when a character lands on the page because there are constraints there. You know. But I also think that writing a novel is it's like putting a few planets in orbit around the sun. And one of the orbits that one of the boys that I threw in is just this adoration for their father, you know, and it's just and I think in novels specifically, you need to return to these sort of motifs, these sentiments, these ideas, and build on them. And I think that the undoing of the boys in the book and the undoing of my relationship with my father aren't so dissimilar in the sense that you recognize that no matter what you do, love isn't enough. love is never enough. This glorification of love as this sort of like eternal balm is wrong. I can love my father as much as I could be filled with love for him. And I have been for periods of my life.
Yeah.
And what does that do to change anything in our relationship other than maybe hurt me by making me continue to return to hope or to see the potential for change or to let myself be manipulated? So I do think at the core, love is essential because it allows you to see truth. It allows you to see people honestly. And at the same time, I think when you disassociate from the love, when you recognize that that's just a part of the picture, then something far more powerful happens because love can exist independently of judgment.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of like when you're teaching and you're teaching undergrads and you get this sort of student stories that are clearly autobiographical, and you get those students who are sort of writing through their pain, their trauma, and they're writing with an axe to grind, right? And they want to make sure that everyone knows that this character is a fucking monster. And there's just no redeeming them, right? And very rarely does that seem to work, right? Like very rarely is that character compelling or even believable. And we always, we're sitting at the front of the table and we're thinking like, well, surely this person has some qualities that are not reprehensible or that we're not repelled by. And the writer's like, nope, no, they don't, because they're not ready to see the real human model that way. They don't have that distance or that detachment from their own pain.
And it's a shame because all it does is create this loop in which you repeat it. You repeat your own suffering and it consumes your identity.
So is that prior to the art then? The sort of facing down your own trauma?
I think the art helps you face it down because as you said, you can't just put a monster on the page and let it live. It becomes two-dimensional. And so it's actually learning to texture these characters with compassion or with vulnerability. That's when you start to see the page come to life. And in that way, I think
that's starting to sound a lot like our teacher, George Saunders, right? The 1,000 passes through the manuscript, right? Through the story or through the novel, where what you're really doing is sort of an exercise in empathy, where you're looking at these characters who may be ridiculous, maybe malignant, but you're looking for some new dimension to their humanity each time you go through. And every time you add that, it actually makes the story deeper and more true, because human beings are fucking complex and we kind of have these infinite dimensions. But in that way, yeah, it's sort of combining this sort of therapeutic notion of working through one's own suffering, one's own trauma, with a very aesthetic process of trying to make a work of art better or truer or more meaningful.
It's beautifully said. What happens is it almost becomes like an aspirational model for life, where you see this beauty and this compassion, this exercise and all of that, like really work on the page at a certain point. At some point, you spend enough time with it and it's come to life in a way where you want to model that behavior. You can do that. You can do that as a human, right? You can actually look out into the world and see that guy who just gave me the finger, and I want to get so mad at him. He just told me to F you and my kids in the car, and then I'm just like, hey, my kid's in the car. And he's like, well, fuck him too. I'm just like, how are you so angry right now? And I want to scream at him. And then you take that moment and it probably happens an hour later and you're like, God, that guy must be going through it. Like what's his life look like?
Because it's iterative, right? I mean, George's whole thing is that this is why we don't publish first drafts, because in the first draft and the second draft and the 10th draft and the 100th draft, that guy's still a fucking asshole. He's still just a monster. But on the 101st draft, you realize that, his kid has bone disease or whatever. I mean, that's the kind of Wallace example, right? That like, maybe the person is a dick in traffic because their child is very sick and they're trying to get to the hospital. But the hard part about daily life as a human being is that we don't get the chance in the moment for this kind of iterative process of revision. We just react.
That's true, but I think the iterative is about behavior, right? It's like if you're working on changing your behavior, then actually the lens through which you see the world is iterative. You might not be your best self like on Tuesday, but if you pay attention to like a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, eventually you might actually come forth with your best self. It's one of the things that's so refreshing to being around someone like George Saunders is that.
I thought you were going to say me, because it's such an AA notion, right? The kind of progress, not perfection, one day at a time. Today's all we get, 24 hours. We just try to, make a little bit of progress today. But yeah, go ahead. Talk about George. It's fine.
No, you needed to talk about yourself. I know it's been a while.
It is, boy, it's been flashing red for a while now.
But yes, and like AA, it's just you're around people who you're just constantly amazed by their ability to see your best self. And it's totally refreshing.
That's George. That's George Saunders.
George.
To the degree of like, it's eerie. And I don't, when I was his student and he was sort of patting me on the head and telling me nice things every day, I was like, are you fucking with me? You know what I mean? Like, well, you're the only person who says these things to me. And he's like, because I see you. And I'm like, no, you've been conned by me somehow. It's the only possible explanation.
Well, that might be true in your case.
Yeah, probably. But he does. Yeah, that's what's special about him, is that he's quicker than others to sort of see that beauty or see that just that value.
But I think part of that is the practice of writing. I do think that I think it's a form of meditation,
and Buddhism.
It's like,
his writing and his Buddhism, right?
But
mindfulness. You don't need as many revisions if you're mindful, if you're fucking paying attention, right?
If you're focused on your art in that way and you spend enough time writing with that in mind, just looking for the texture and the layers and the full 3D understanding of your characters. And I think you spend more time in life doing that and you're quicker to that instinct.
It strikes me, and obviously I haven't read your second novel yet. I'm waiting with bated breath for the chance to do that. But your first novel is, if you'll forgive me for sort of reducing it to this, but it's sort of, here's the book where the writer works through their sort of worst trauma, and out of that makes the work of art. Is there something to the idea that in your second novel, you're working through maybe your greatest fear? Something that you're sort of looking forward and thinking, God, this could be the worst thing that could happen to me at this point in my life. You are the father of a beautiful 2-year-old son, correct? 2-year-old?
2.5, yeah.
2.5. And somehow still the husband to a woman who's just far, far superior to you in every way. And I can say that because it's also true for me. You have a great marriage. You have a great family. You've built this wonderful life for yourself. And you're writing a novel where that all is destroyed and taken away from a guy. So has that occurred to you? Is that, or do you reject that interpretation?
I'll say that I started this book before Lawrence was even conceived. And so I will say that had I known that all that was going to happen, I probably would have picked something else to write about, if that's even possible, because you're compelled to write the things you're compelled to write. I think mostly what interested me about this second book was about the maintenance of a marriage.
Yeah.
And I think that works. That works in terms of a projection of fear. I want to spend the rest of my life with Justine, and working through some of the ways in which that, so when you're in a marriage, we've been married for 7 years now, and you have a young child, the conversations just become the same over and over and over again. And sometimes it's really hard to figure out what you really want to say, because most of the time you're like, I'm talked out, I don't want to do any more logistics today.
I find that like the difficulty with communication over the long term, of course, there are your stressful times, your inflection points where you're not communicating well because you're just both frazzled or angry or fearful about what's going on with your kid, and you just kind of aren't your best selves. But the more kind of banal and I think corrosive effect of children on a marriage is that you forget to talk about anything else. They monopolize your conversations. Like you used to kind of, at the end of the day, you meet on the couch in your bedroom or wherever, or in the kitchen, and talk about all kinds of shit. And now there's that kind of magnetic force of you have to talk about the kids because there's things going on with them that need discussion. I've noticed it a few times where like one of us will begin a conversation that is extracurricular, right? That is not about our children, and give it 20 seconds and someone's brought up one of our kids. And it just gets waylaid into yet another discussion about that. And I think it is important to be mindful of that like we have to make sure our relationship continues to sort of exist and prosper in other, fields beyond just us as parents, right? That we're still two people. We're still two adults who are interested in one another and what each other think.
It can be hard to do. I mean, one of the most sort of like optimistic and yet also corrosive side effects to having a child in my household is that my wife and I don't fight anymore. It's like, which is like, fighting's okay. Fighting's good. Sometimes, you work through stuff.
Because of the audience, because of the audience of
it's
Lawrence.
It's not just the audience. It's actually just this the love of this shared project, where it's just, we're just not angry with each other. Because we're just like, we only have one child. I feel like if you have multiple children, maybe it's a little bit more chaotic, but we're really just like bottlenecking down into this beautiful boy. And it's like, we just love being around him and he likes being around us. To be a father right now feels like I endure a little death every day. Like, because that day is gone. And it's just
more.
Yeah, exactly. Except, meant in a
I bet you endure a couple more than just one a day, Danny, knowing you as well as I do.
But I'm just sad that the day is gone because he's just getting older, and I just loved this day.
I feel that's very familiar to me, and I'm sort of warmly nostalgic for the first couple years of being parents to an only child, where you're both just kind of constantly hovering over him in adoration. Like it's some fucking Renaissance painting, and you're both just like, look at the glory shooting from his eyes. Yeah, there it is a glide path. I think it can be, right? It outside calamities notwithstanding and other kinds of difficulties. Like you got a healthy kid and you have a healthy marriage, and those first couple years are really, really beautiful. And then you have the second one, Danny. Then you have the second one. You got to have the second one so you can look back at this period as warmly nostalgic as I do.
Were you a second child?
I was, yeah.
I was a second child.
There you go.
Where would the world be without second children?
Well, but see, I think and I was talking to another guest about this. I think there's a big difference between being 2 of 2 and 2 of 3. Because what you are, Daniel, is the middle child. And that's a whole different species from what I am.
But I'm the second son. So I think it's a White Stripes song. So I'm good.
Yeah, well, the second child, if you're 2 of 2, then what you are is the second and third combined. You're a hybrid, right? You're the baby and the middle child. You're the sort of conciliator and the precious one. Whereas you, I think, would probably just be the conciliator. You're just the mediator. You're the referee. But I'm a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah, well, I'm not interested in complexity. I'm interested in just intensity.
All right. Last question for you, Danny, is that I think a lot on this podcast about kind of pop psych notion of like unparenting yourself, right? As sort of like, as you're learning how to be a parent, you're also confronted with the ways that you were parented and the ways that you grew up being warped and warping yourself to accommodate the difficulties of your family of origin, right? Whether they came from your parents or your siblings or your circumstances or wherever the fuck they came from, you had to grow up in a certain way, and you're hardwired at some point for family relation. And I didn't think about that for most of my 20s and in the beginning of my 30s because it wasn't relevant to what was going on in my life. But when I had a kid and when my kid started to grow, and then I had another, and I'm really kind of seeing how I am naturally as a father, my kind of intrinsic behaviors and my reflexes and just all of that hardwired shit, I have to also kind of recognize the aspects of that are a product of my own childhood, my own upbringing, my own parents. Does that ever come into play for you? Do you ever think about the relationship between your childhood and Lawrence's childhood that you are trying to curate and guide and protect?
I think, yes. I think part of that is trying to treat my marriage like it's precious, remembering that it's precious, because my father's married 3 times. My mother's been married multiple times. And they were never unified in our house. And that division became a kind of scorecard, that I still have in my mind. Like, even with my wife, I'm just like, I'm keeping score. And it's not a good characteristic. And I didn't realize that until I had a child, right? Oh, well, I was with him all day. What were you doing? Well, you're going to be with him tomorrow. So
but on some level, Danny, you did realize it, because the opening scene of your novel, and it's so brilliant. The way you introduce this character of your father is as the comforter to his boys, as he's able to, and in one fell swoop, be there for them after a violent episode of abuse that their mother doles out, to be there for them, and at the same time to sort of villainize her and manipulate them into, this bond with him, right? This sort of Machiavellian opportunity that he sees to say, you poor boys, oh, she did this to you, come here, right? Like you saw that on some level you saw
it, but drawing the link between you, as you're saying, the link is so direct, and it sometimes a child is the thing that makes you hyper aware of that. So I think part of being obviously a good father is also is being a good husband, and trying to create the dynamic of a safe and loving home. The expectation that men are still supposed to be disciplinarians in ways, I always have trouble with that, because I feel ill-equipped. like the ways that I was taught that one should be disciplined is not the way that I want to discipline. And so, while I'm never physical with my son, of course, but there are times where their expectation is on me to handle some misbehavior, and all of a sudden I find my voice like bellowing through the house, and it's just fear. I'm trying to instill fear, and like in ways that the echoes come back into me, and I can still, I still remember what it feels like, to be terrified, of my father.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and to hear that voice, it echoes in every direction.
Do you think you guys will have a second or third or fourth?
Definitely not a third or a fourth. I think it's important for Justine that for a sibling, it feels less critical to me that he have a sibling. He's got dad, he's got mom.
Yeah,
he'll have some friends, but I think we're gonna have a second child. Can I ask, do you love do you love Nico as much as you love Julian?
Between you and me,
not.
No, of course. And they're wildly different people. They're wildly different people. I mean, having a second kid is, number one, it's where the real psychodrama begins, right? Because it's not so kind of unified in the way that you and Justine are sort of, again, like pouring your attention and affection on this one human being who's just sort of this perfect little angel. Once you have two, there's an interaction there. And so those deep-rooted familial dynamics start to play out in more uncontrolled ways. I have 2 boys. They're both super rambunctious, one more than the other so far. The older one is more of a handful than the little one.
He's probably 2 handfuls.
But
he's not just one.
Yeah, he's a couple of handfuls. He's come a long way from that one night in Brooklyn where he got to hang out with you. So I find myself, like, I was really relating to what you were saying about like hearing your voice echo through the house. And that for me is in the context of like separating them or saving them from like dive bombing off the couch or the top of the stairs. There's just so much more minute by minute opportunities for chaos and destruction and injury when you have 2.
Yeah.
that you do find yourself in that role of disciplinarian so much more. It's just messier and more chaotic.
Sure.
It's great, man. It's great. Do it. Get that nice girl pregnant again.
I'll send her a text right now.
What are you doing? Go on.
Chris said.
It's time. No, man, you guys got to do what feels right. And, in other words, what she wants. It's her call, Danny.
I'm learning a lot.
All right, brother. Thank you for hanging out today, man.
Thanks for having me, Chris. And would you get that novel done, please? Because the world would like to see it.
Yeah. You mean the new one? Yeah, I'll get the new one done too.
Yeah.
One of the boys, Danny, I'm still to this day so very fucking proud of you, my good friend, for writing this beautiful book that everyone needs to buy and read and cherish. And I'm so excited for Walk the Darkness Down, July 2023. Danny Magariel, go get it.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, buddy.
It's good to see you.
No. I'm not done.
Okay.
For my last trick. Ladies and gentlemen, do you see anything in that hat?
I don't see anything in that hat. It's an empty hat.
Well,
That hat has absolutely nothing in it.
watch this. Ah!
Oh,
What?
Rabbit. It's a rabbit. He pulled that rabbit out of his hat.
Thank you.
Very good. Bravo.
Good show.
Isn't Danny great? I tell you what, that's one of my favorite people on planet Earth. Danny, if you're listening, go have another kid and write another book and invite me over for dinner. That's all for Padre. I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope it helps you reflect, mull, ponder, contemplate the ways in which we can become the sort of people who won't be the cause of anyone's trauma, especially our kids. I hope you'll spread the news about Padre far and wide, but especially on those little rating and comment features, wherever you're downloading us. And most of all, I hope you'll join us next time, when I'll be talking to the philosopher and heavyweight in the world of podcasting, the host of Very Bad Wizards, and my friend, Tamler Summers. Be there. Do it. Come along. Hurry up, please. It's time. Padre is created and produced by me, Chris Bryant. Original artwork for the show is by David Wojo. Special thanks to Brad Franco and Julian and Nico Benz Brunt.